sold to a Mormon elder as a seventh wife. A Lakota chief made her his first and only. The morning they brought her into my camp, I was sharpening a knife. Not because I needed to. The blade was already right. I do that sometimes, hold a thing and work it when my mind won't settle. My hands know what to do with themselves even when the rest of me doesn't. She was standing between two of my younger warriors, Chayton on her left, Motto on her right, and she wasn't crying. That's what I noticed first. Most white women they'd brought to me over the years, captives, strays, a trader's wife once who'd gotten separated from her wagon, they cried. Or they went rigid and silent with a kind of terror so thick it was almost a smell. This one had been crying, I could see that. Her eyes were raw at the edges, but she'd stopped. She was looking at my camp the way a person looks at a thing they're trying to understand, not a thing they're afraid of. I kept sharpening the knife, let her look. Chayton told me what they'd found. She was on the trail east of the river on foot, no horse, no provisions worth naming. A wool coat 3 sizes too large for her. She'd been walking since before dawn by the look of her feet. They'd watched her from the ridge for a while before coming down, and she hadn't flinched when she heard them. She'd stopped walking, turned to face them, and put her hands out where they could see them. That detail stayed with me. I asked her in English what she was doing on that trail alone. She looked at me the way you look at a person, not at a threat, and she said, "Leaving." Just that. I asked her what she was leaving. She said, "A marriage I never agreed to." I should tell you something about myself before I go further, because without it the rest of this won't make sense. I am Kanji. In English they would say Raven. I was chief of my band for 11 years by then, and I had come to that position young, younger than most, and I had held it the way you hold something in both hands when you know it is the only thing keeping everything else from falling. I was not an easy man. I knew that. My warriors respected me and also, I think, kept a careful distance from me, the way you keep from a fire that is burning well, close enough for the warmth, not so close you forget it can take your eyebrows. I had had a wife. Her name was Winona. She died in the winter 6 years before this, taking our son with her, and after that I didn't look for another. It wasn't grief, exactly, not by then. It was more like I had learned to arrange my life so the empty part didn't show, the way you learn to favor a leg that never healed right. You stop noticing the limp until someone points at it. No one in my camp would have pointed at it. That is part of what it is to be the one in charge. People show you the parts of themselves that keep things smooth. You show them the same. After a while you stop being sure what's underneath, for any of you. So, Kanji, 11 years a chief, alone 6 years, not unhappy exactly. Just running a long distance at a steady pace and not letting myself think too hard about the finish. That is who was sitting there sharpening a knife when they brought her to me. Her name was Nora Vane. She told me this herself, the same afternoon, when I had water and food brought and told her she would not be harmed. She was maybe 25, though she looked older in some ways and younger in others. Dark hair, brown eyes, a face that had some weathering on it already. Not a soft life, I could see that. She ate the food carefully, not greedily, the way someone eats when they've been hungry before and know to be deliberate about it. I let her rest and eat, and then I sat with her again as the sun was getting low. She told me about herself in pieces, not in the neat order people tell stories when they're trying to impress someone. She came from Ohio. Her father had died. Her mother had remarried a man who had connections to a community of settlers following a branch of the Mormon faith out west. When she was 22, they arranged a marriage for her to a man named Orson Price. He was 51. He had 6 wives already. He'd paid her stepfather in horses and seed grain. She said it plainly, no performance around it, just facts laid out like stones. I asked her if she had agreed to it. She said they didn't ask. She'd lasted 3 years in Price's household. She told me it wasn't violent, not in the way you might think. He didn't beat her. He barely noticed her. She was an object in a room full of objects, and the part of her that was a person had started to go quiet, the way a lamp goes low when you haven't trimmed it and it's running out of oil. She said she'd woken up one morning and looked at her hands and thought, I am disappearing, and she'd made a decision before she'd even sat up straight. She'd taken the coat from a peg by the door. She'd taken a piece of cornbread from the pan, and she'd walked out before the sun was up. That's what my men had found, a woman walking east in a wool coat, carrying nothing but the certainty that whatever was behind her was worse than whatever was ahead. I should have sent her on. I knew that even then, given her provisions and a direction, and wished her well. That was the clean thing, the uncomplicated thing. I told myself I was keeping her because the trail east was not safe in that season. There had been trouble with a band of raiders, white men with no affiliation to anything respectable, who worked the routes and hit anyone who looked manageable. A woman alone would not survive a meeting with them. This was true. It was not the whole truth. The whole truth was that I wanted to keep talking to her, which I hadn't wanted to do with anyone in a long time. I had a tent put up for her apart from the others, and I told my people she was a guest, under my protection. The word I used has weight in my language. It doesn't just mean safe. It means the chief himself stands between you and any harm. My people heard it and said nothing, but I saw a few of the older women look at each other with a certain expression. I ignored that. She stayed. The trail east stayed dangerous, or I kept telling her it did, and she didn't push on the question. Maybe she wasn't in a hurry. Maybe she had no clear destination, and the camp for now was as good a direction as any. She was careful with the people around her, respectful without being servile. She watched the women doing their work, the hide scraping, the cooking, the construction, and she didn't treat it like something foreign and strange to study. She just watched, and then she asked if she could help, and when they said yes, she put her hands to the work and learned what they showed her. That made a difference. People respond to that, someone who comes in and doesn't put themselves above the work. I watched all of this from the particular distance a chief keeps, or I told myself it was a chief's distance. I was paying more attention to her than that. She had a habit of looking at the horizon in the early evening, facing west, and her face would go very still. Not sad exactly, something more complicated than sad, like she was having a conversation with something she couldn't name. I found myself standing near her once, at that time of evening, not quite beside her but not far, and I said without planning to, "What do you see out there?" She considered the question seriously, the way she did most questions. She said, "I'm trying to figure out if I'm free." I didn't say anything to that. I just stood with her a while looking west. 3 weeks she'd been in my camp when the trouble came. 2 white men, hard-looking, riding slow through the outer edge of our territory with the kind of deliberate confidence that means they've thought out what they're willing to do. I knew the type. They weren't raiders, or not primarily. They were hired retrieval. Price had sent for her. My scouts had seen them before they saw us, so I had time to think. I walked out to meet them myself with Chayton and 2 others, and I let them say their piece. One of them, the spokesman, was polite about it in the way that is actually a form of contempt, smooth, and even treating you like something to be managed. He said they were looking for a woman matching her description, that she was the property of a family of settlers, that they had legal documentation. I let him finish. Then I said she was not here. He looked at me for a while, looked at the camp behind me, looked at me again. I don't have a memorable face, or rather, I have a face that people look at and decide doesn't show much. That is useful. I have spent years making sure of it. I said it again, "She is not here." He nodded slowly, like he was filing something away. They left. I went back into camp and I found Nora standing outside her tent. She'd heard. Her face was doing that still thing, but underneath it something else was moving, something more like fear than I'd seen from her before. I told her what I'd told them. She said they'll come back. I said, I know. She looked at me for a moment and then she said, why would you do that? Why would you lie to them for me? I didn't answer right away. I thought about it because the question deserved that. Then I said, because you are here under my protection, and what I said was that you are not here for them. She held on that distinction. I could see her turning it over. Then she said, that is either the most precise thing anyone has ever said to me, or you're better at splitting a word than anyone I've met. I said, can it be both? It was the first time I'd seen her almost smile. They did come back. Not the 2 men, 5 this time, and they came at night, which told me the polite approach was done. I'd had my camp arrange for it. It went badly for them and not for us, and in the end they left without her and without a fight that would have cost more than it was worth. I won't give you the details. It was managed and it was conclusive, and the important thing is that after that night Price's people didn't come again. What I want to tell you is what happened that night in the waiting, the hours before they arrived when we knew they were coming. Nora asked me if she could stand with my people through it, not hidden away. She didn't put it as a request exactly, she said. I know how to be useful. Tell me where. And something in the way she said it, straight and clear, not performing bravery but just stating a fact about herself, I believed her. I put her with the older women back from the main positions where her job was eyes and signal. She did it well. After, one of the older women, Takota's wife, who has never been easy to impress, told me she was steady. Didn't flinch, didn't freeze. I stored that away without quite admitting to myself why. The night after the trouble, the camp was quiet and I was sitting with the fire burning low, too wounded to sleep and too tired to think straight, and Nora came and sat beside me. Not across from me, beside. She didn't say anything for a while. Neither did I. The fire was doing what fires do, shifting and settling, and somewhere out on the plain a bird was doing something complicated in the dark. After a while she said, "Can I ask you something?" I said yes. She said, "Are you lonely?" It wasn't what I expected. People ask me many things. They ask me about the land, about disputes, about what I'll do when the soldiers come closer, which they always do. No one had asked me that, not in years, maybe not ever, not in that plain a way. I looked at the fire. I said yes. She nodded, like that confirmed something she'd already thought. She said, "I have been lonely my whole adult life, even in that house full of people, maybe especially then." She was quiet a moment. "I think it's different when you're lonely in a crowd than when you're lonely alone. In the crowd you can pretend. Alone, you at least know what you are." I thought about my 11 years and what they actually felt like on the inside, underneath the straightness of my back and the clearness of my voice, and the 1,000 decisions I made that had to look certain. I said, "I know what you mean." She turned to look at me then. Actually look, the way I said she looked at things, like she was trying to understand something, not just see it. She said, "You're a good man, Kanji. I want you to know that I see that, not the chief, the man." I don't know the last time anyone said something like that to me. The chief has 1,000 people who tell him he is strong, wise, right. The man inside the chief, that person waits a long time between being seen. I didn't have words for a moment. That doesn't happen to me. Then I said, "You say that like you know me." She said, "I've been watching you for 3 weeks. I think I might know you better than most of the people who have known you for 30 years. They see the position. I see," she stopped, looked for the word. "The cost. I see what it costs you." The fire cracked. Out on the plain the bird had gone quiet. I said, "And you're not afraid of that?" She said, "No, I'm not afraid of much anymore. I used to be. I think fear wore itself out on me." I want to tell this part carefully because it's easy to make it sound like a thing that happened quickly, or like a fever, or like she was just glad to be safe and I was just glad for the company. None of that is true. What happened between us happened slowly, the way things that are real tend to. Another week in camp. Then another. The trail east became genuinely safe, and I stopped having reason to say it wasn't, and I had to let the pretense go, and I told her so. I said the road was open now. She didn't move. We were standing at the horses, and she was running her hand along the neck of the bay gelding she'd been riding sometimes when I let her, and she didn't look at me when I said it, just kept her hand moving on the horse's neck. She said, "Where would I go?" I said, "Wherever you want, you're free." She said, "I don't have a home. I had a father's house until I didn't. I had a husband's house until I left it. I've never had," she stopped. "I've never stayed somewhere because I wanted to." I said, "You could stay somewhere because you wanted to." She turned from the horse and looked at me. She said, "Would that be here?" There was a long quiet. The gelding moved his foot in the dirt. Somewhere behind us a child was laughing. I said, "I'm not asking you to stay. I wouldn't ask that. You came here without being asked, and you would have to stay the same way, or it means nothing." She said, "You are the most careful man I have ever met." I said, "Yes." She said, "I mean that as a good thing." I said, "I know." She was still looking at me with that direct, thinking look, and then she said, "Then let me be as plain as you are. I want to stay. I want to stay because this is the first place I have been in years where I felt like a person, and most of that is because of you." She came closer. "I'm not confused about what I'm saying. I'm not saying it because I'm afraid or grateful. I'm saying it because I've had 3 weeks to think about it, and I'm sure." When I took her hands, both of them, not grabbing, just taking them in mine, she held on. She was small compared to me, but she didn't feel small. She felt like something solid. I said, "There are things that come with this, my people, my life, the way things are, which is not always easy." She said, "I walked out of a house with a piece of cornbread and no plan, and I've been fine. I think I can manage difficult." I said, "Yes, I think you can." We were married in the way of my people. Simple, honest, witnessed. The older women made sure the ceremony was right and treated her like someone worth the care. I want to say something about that night, and I want to say it plainly, because this is my life I'm telling, not a story I heard. I had been alone a long time. 6 years. Before that, Winona was a good woman, and I loved her, and that grief was real. But this was different, not bigger and not smaller, different. Nora came to our home that night with all of herself. Not performing anything, not afraid, not relieved. Just there. Present. She put her hand on the side of my face the way you touch something you have decided belongs to you and you are not shy about it. And she looked at me for a moment before anything else. Just looked. And what I saw in her face was something I hadn't seen from anyone in a very long time. She thought I was worth it. Not the position, not the protection, not the usefulness. Me. The cost and the loneliness and the careful, wound-up man who sharpens knives when his mind won't settle. Worth it. I'll tell you something. That is not a small thing. That is not a small thing at all. There are things after that which I could tell you and I won't. Some things don't need an audience. What I will tell you is how the years went. She learned my language. Not perfectly, not fast, but deliberately, the way she did everything, one word at a time, asking questions, going back and fixing what she got wrong. By the 2nd year, she could make herself understood to anyone in camp. By the 3rd, she was having long conversations with Lakota's wife, who trusted almost no one, and making her laugh, which I had never been able to do. She had a way with the sick. No training, no medicine beyond what she learned from the women who knew plants. Just patience and a certain steadiness, the quality of not panicking, which is worth more than most people understand. More than once she sat up through a whole night with a child who was badly fevered, and the child came through. Whether that was her or chance I can't say, but people started sending for her. That did something to her. I watched it happen. The part of her that had been going quiet in that house in the settlement, going out like an untrimmed lamp, came back. She stood straighter. She laughed more easily. Not relief, growth. She was becoming more of herself every year, and I had the privilege of watching it and being next to it. What she did for me, I will try to say without overstating it. She made it possible to put down something I'd been carrying so long I'd stopped feeling the weight. 11 years of having no one to simply be a man with, of wearing the chief every hour. She would come and sit beside me in the evenings, the way she'd sat beside me that first night at the fire, just beside, close, and she would ask me what I was thinking and actually want to know. And I could tell her about the decisions that were hard, about the ones I wasn't sure of, about the fear I'd never been able to say out loud, which was that someday I would have led my people as best I could and it wouldn't have been enough, and I wouldn't know it until it was too late. She didn't fix that fear. She didn't tell me everything would be fine. She's too honest for that, and I wouldn't have believed it anyway. But she stayed in it with me, that dark space, and she was not afraid of it. And that is the difference between someone who sees you and someone who sees the version of you that doesn't need anything. I have been seen by her fully. That is a thing I did not expect to have. There's one more thing I want to tell you. Years later, we had children by then, 2 sons, a daughter who had her mother's directness and her eyes, my temperament and my stubbornness, which combination I apologize to the world for. I was hurt. Bad. A fall from a horse in the kind of mundane way that is somehow worse than something with more dignity. Broke ribs bad, and one of them went somewhere it shouldn't have, and for a few days it wasn't certain. I was not a good patient, I'll say that plainly. I was accustomed to being the capable one, the one who held things together, and lying flat while the camp managed without me, and Nora managed me was against everything in my nature. I was difficult, probably more difficult than a man with a punctured chest has any right to be. She sat with me through the worst of it, long nights of difficult breathing, her hand finding mine in the dark and staying there. When I was bad-tempered and sharp with her, which I was, she didn't go quiet and absorb it the way a woman who is afraid of you does. She told me to stop, plainly without heat. She said, "You are hurt and I understand that, but I am not going to sit here and let you take it out on me, and when you're better you'll thank me for saying so." Then she stayed. Just stayed right there, telling me to be better and being willing to weather that I wasn't yet. I don't know when I started crying. I didn't know I was until she made a sound and I realized she'd heard it, and then she moved carefully because of the ribs, and she put her hand on my face the same way she had years back that first night, and she looked at me. She said, "You are going to be fine, and even if you weren't, I would stay." Even if you weren't. I've thought about that in the years since, about the fullness of what she meant by it. Not just the obvious, the whole of it. She'd seen the worst of me, the difficult, the proud, the man who sharpens knives when he can't settle, and she would stay through that too. Not despite it, including it, all of it. That is what a good woman is. Not soft and easily grateful. Not a thing that needs to be protected into gratitude. A person who chooses you with her full eyes open and chooses you again, every day. And you know it every time because she's not doing it out of obligation or fear or the lack of anything better. She did it because she wanted to. I am Kanji, Raven. I was a chief for 23 years before I handed that weight to my oldest son and told him I'd help him learn the parts that took me longest to figure out. I live now with less to carry and more to see. I am sitting on the step of our home as I tell you this. The sun is going down out across the plain, turning everything it touches the color of old copper. Somewhere behind me, I can hear my wife moving around inside, the sound she makes without thinking, the specific small noises of a person who is comfortable in their place. I am the luckiest man I know, not because things were easy, they weren't. Not because I was ever the most impressive man in any room, I wasn't by some measures, but because one morning my warriors brought a woman in a too big coat into my camp, a woman who had been sold like livestock and had walked herself free of it, and she looked at my world and decided to understand it rather than fear it. She looked at me and decided to see what I actually was, not what I appeared to be. She gave me back the part of myself I'd been running from for 6 years. The part that needed. The part that wasn't just a chief but a man, tired and hopeful and glad when someone is glad to see him. That part is not small. The door opens behind me. Her hand comes to rest on my shoulder, light, sure, the way her hands are always sure. She says it's getting cold. I put my hand over hers. We watch the last of the sun go down together, and I don't say anything because I don't need to, and that is its own kind of answer.